Hey guys! Tonight we're diving into one of the most unexpectedly obsessive chapters of British history, a time when polite society lost its mind over ferns. Yes, ferns. Those leafy, frondy, shade-loving plants you probably walk past without a second thought. But back in Victorian England, these innocent green things sparked a full-blown national obsession. Imagine glasshouses stuffed to bursting, secret garden hunts, and grown adults fighting over the last delicate specimen from a rocky ravine. Sounds peaceful. You probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where and when you're all listening from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in a damp English garden, sometime around 1855. There's a light drizzle in the air, you can feel it gently misting your face. You pull your wool coat tighter around you and step forward. All around, an odd hush hangs in the air, broken only by the distant snip of garden shears and the echoing drip of water on glass. You peer into an elaborate greenhouse, its glass panes beaded with condensation, and what do you see? Ferns, dozens, hundreds of ferns, each lovingly potted, labelled with Latin names longer than most Victorian marriages, and arranged like trophies in a museum. Welcome to the era of pterodomania, or fern madness. Coined in 1855 by Charles Kingsley, a clergyman and amateur naturalist, the term wasn't meant kindly. It was a cheeky jab at the growing mania for all things ferny. And it wasn't just about owning a few plants. This was a lifestyle, a competition, a status symbol. You weren't just collecting greenery, you were curating taste. Pterodomania infected everyone from upper-class botanists to middle-class matrons. Entire households were rearranged to make space for the latest acquisitions. Fern embroidery sprouted on curtains, dresses, even men's waistcoats. You might be sipping tea from a cup rimmed with fern motifs, while writing love letters on fern-printed stationery. There were fern clubs, fern books, fern prints, fern poetry. Honestly, if someone could have invented fern-flavored ice cream, they probably would have. And like any obsession worth its spores, it had its gear. You'd need field guides, of course, preferably leather-bound and smelling faintly of mold. You'd also want a spade, a basket, perhaps a pocket magnifier for inspecting tiny the spore-producing bits. On the underside of fern leaves, don't know what sori are? Shame on you. In 1860, that was practically social suicide. Historians still argue whether the craze was mostly a genuine love for nature or a thinly veiled excuse for social posturing, but you can't deny the scale. Local newspapers printed weekly fern spotting reports. Schools took students on educational fern hunts, which conveniently involved a lot of fresh air and very little actual learning. There were even heated debates in church newsletters about whether pterodomania was godly appreciation of creation or dangerously close to idolatry. Spoiler, the ferns were winning. You shuffle forward through the greenhouse now, and the air grows warmer, thicker. Someone's stoked a coal-fired boiler nearby to keep the humidity just right. You wipe a foggy window with your sleeve and peer out at a neighbor's garden. They, too, have installed a glass house, though slightly smaller than this one. You smirk. Competition among fern enthusiasts is silent but brutal. Their polystitchum setiferum looks a little parched. Amateurs, there's something oddly comforting about how deep this obsession goes. Victorian England, for all its empire-building and moralizing, had a soft spot for small wonders. Ferns, with their ancient lineage and quiet elegance, offered a break from the clamour of industrial life. Some ferns haven't changed much since the time of the dinosaurs, a fact Victorians found deeply romantic. Collecting them felt like touching time itself. One woman, Margaret Bradshaw, reportedly spent 6 weeks mapping every single fern species in her county, armed with nothing but a notepad and stubborn determination. Another man, Samuel Gibson, is said to have built a 3-tiered fern grotto in his cellar, complete with dripping water pipes to simulate natural conditions. Is that charming? Or deeply unwell? You decide. You pass a table inside the greenhouse, where a prized specimen Asplenium scolopendrium rests in a silver-trimmed pot. Known as the heart-stung fern, it's long, sleek, and glossy. Victorian collectors loved it because it didn't look like a typical fern. It stood out. It had flair. Also, it was temperamental, hard to cultivate, prone to fungal issues, and therefore perfect for bragging rights. Somewhere behind you, a gardener sneezes. Probably the spores again dotters with all trends. There were moments when it all went a bit too far. One pamphlet from the 1870s sternly warned of social imbalance caused by plant obsession. The author was clearly a party pooper, but they weren't entirely wrong. When people start skipping weddings to go on fern hikes, you know something's shifted, and yet there's something weirdly admirable about the intensity. Modern hobbies often flicker in and out like app updates, but these folks, they committed. They built heated rooms, memorized Latin names, wrote odes to leaf symmetry. They got into long, handwritten arguments about whether a new hybrid deserved its own classification. Historians still argue whether some of those hybrids were naturally occurring, or lovingly engineered behind the greenhouse when no one was. Looking, you crouch beside a shallow stone basin where miniature ferns grow among moss-covered rocks. A handwritten label reads Hymenophyllum wilsoni. You trace the letters slowly. It's a filmy fern, almost translucent. In Victorian times, owning one meant you had both money and patience. These little guys need near-constant misting and very specific lighting. Some enthusiasts even designed automated candle-powered foggers. Let that sink in. Victorian candle fog machines. For ferns, outside the rain picks up, but inside, the air smells rich damp soil, warm bark, a faint metallic tang from the watering and someone left nearby. You sigh. There's no denying it. You, too, might be coming down with a mild case of pterodomania. You step back from the humid embrace of the greenhouse and into the fresh drizzle of a quiet Victorian lane. The smell of wet cobblestones and horse manure blends with distant chimney smoke. Your boots squelch slightly with each step as you walk, past terraced houses, each with a small, carefully tended garden, and you realize that behind nearly every lace-curtained window, there might just be a fern. But not all ferns or fern keepers are created equal. Welcome to the wonderfully awkward world of class, cloaky, and curiosity, where collecting greenery became a surprisingly cutthroat way to climb the social ladder. You pause in front of a modest townhouse. A polished brass sign reads, Mrs. Tilbury's Botanical Cabinet appointments encouraged. You don't have one, of course, but you gently push the door open anyway. Inside, the air is perfumed with lavender, tea leaves, and something vaguely vegetal. Mrs. Tilbury appears from behind a curtain, her hair immaculately pinned and her spectacles pushed halfway down. Her nose. She doesn't smile. Instead, she eyes your damp coat and the mud on your cuffs. You are assessed. This was the Victorian fern scene in a nutshell, ostensibly about nature, but soaked in unspoken social rules. Fern collecting wasn't just a hobby. It was a quiet war of class. Posturing. If you were a gentleman with a country estate, ferns filled your heated glasshouse. If you were middle class and on the rise, a tidy fern case in your front parlour announced your moral refinement and your decorative flair. If you were poor, well, ferns still grew wild in hedgerows, but good luck convincing anyone to take your spore samples seriously. Historians still argue whether fern collecting truly democratized botanical science, or simply mirrored existing inequalities in tweed jackets and flower pots. Back in Mrs. Tilbury's shop, she gestures to a mahogany display case under glass. Inside lie several perfect fronds pressed, labeled, and mounted on crisp white parchment. Each specimen comes with a small tag, found Linton Gorge, 1863. By hand, no spade. This is a flex. Spade-free collection was the ultimate sign of delicate field work. Never mind that most collectors brought an entire toolkit worthy of a minor surgical procedure. You lean closer and spot a miniature cloakia glass dome. once used to protect seedlings from frost, now repurposed to house a single, velvety specimen of trichomaine speciosum. The dome sits on velvet. A tiny sign warns, "Do not breathe on glass." You step back immediately. There's something rather theatrical about the whole display. The Victorians had a knack for turning mundane objects into metaphors. A fern wasn't just a plant, it was a marker of taste, restraint, even morality. Newspapers often praised ferns for being chaste, modest and unassuming, as though these leafy things had actively declined invitations to the opera. The upper classes leaned hard into this narrative, often writing about their ferns as if they were fainting heroines in need of constant supervision. One gentleman, Lord Fanshawe, kept a daily fern diary in which he recorded the emotional progress of his Polypodium vulgare. Wednesday, she appears less wilty. Perhaps she misses the Mozart. Yes, really. Meanwhile, the growing middle class had its own reasons to embrace the fern. The Industrial Revolution had flooded towns with coal smoke and factory clatter. What better way to suggest your home was a peaceful, morally upright sanctuary than by lining your mantelpiece with fern-filled glass? It said, "We may not have a summer estate, but we are spiritually aligned with nature." Bonus points if your ferns looked like they'd been freshly plucked from the Scottish Highlands, even if you bought them from a vendor outside the train. Station. One curious fringe fact: enterprising salesmen began marketing fake fern specimens to those too busy or too urban to forage themselves. These were made from dyed feathers, silk, and even finely cut leather. Everlasting ferns, they were called, a sneaky way to flex your botanical credentials without ever stepping in mud. Still, the snobbery ran deep. A writer in the Gardeners Chronicle once sniffed that fern enthusiasm must be tempered by restraint, else it devolves into tasteless exuberance, which is Victorian for your fern display looks tacky. You leave Mrs. Tilbury's shop and head toward a modest park. Nearby, on a wrought iron bench, two ladies in feathered hats whisper over a newly purchased field guide. They're trying to identify a specimen they found near the churchyard, which might be code for between the vicar's compost bin and the back wall. They glance up as you pass, titter politely, and return to arguing about weather. It's a Dryopteris filixmars or a disappointing weed. Victorian etiquette demanded that women appear passive, yet fern collecting gave them something unique, a socially acceptable excuse to explore the outdoors, examine life through a scientific lens, and sometimes even be a little bit competitive. Later, you'll read about Miss Brewster, who built her own fernarium entirely by hand, scandalizing the neighbors by lifting stones in her front yard while wearing trousers. Legend has it she was banned from the local sewing circle for inviting moss into the home, which, frankly, sounds like a power move. By now the drizzle has eased, and the clouds are parting in a sheepswool sky. You stroll through a row of tidy homes, each boasting ferns in neat little front-facing windows. But if you looked closely, you'd spot the differences. The finer houses had imported varieties in silver-trimmed containers. The middle ones showed off-pressed specimens in frames. The smallest homes, maybe a single rough pot out front, a little brown around the edges, and yet, whether it was manicured or mossy, every fern told a story about status, about longing, about trying quietly, politely to root yourself somewhere a little more beautiful than where you started. You step into the warm embrace of another greenhouse, but this one is different, taller, sleeker. It's the sort of structure that looks like it might lift off and float away if the wind ever got too ambitious. The light filters through the glass in soft, glowing panes, and in the middle of it all sits a large, proud box framed in mahogany and gleaming brass, with crystal-clear panels on all sides. Behold the Wardian case, a humble invention that changed the game forever. It's hard to imagine now, but before this box existed, transporting delicate plants like ferns was a one-way ticket to Shreveltown. Sea voyages, coal smoke, salted winds, none of it was kind to the Fron family. Until one day in the early 1800s, a London physician named Nathaniel Bagshaw Ward accidentally left a moth chrysalis in a sealed jar with some soil. When he checked back weeks later, a fern had sprouted inside, happy as a clam in its own little biosphere. Light bulb moment. Historians still argue whether Ward fully grasped what he'd stumbled upon, or if he was more focused on the moth, but one thing's clear. The Wardian case allowed plants to travel the world, from tropical jungles to London parlours, from Cornish cliffs to Scottish drawing rooms. You kneel beside the shining case now and look inside. There, nestled in gravel and moss, is a young Adianum capillus veneris or maidenhair fern. It shivers ever so slightly as condensation drips down the glass. This isn't just a storage box, it's a brag box, a living declaration that says, I not only collect rare things, I can keep them alive. The Victorians adored them. Some were small enough to sit on tabletops, others as large as wardrobes. And for the wealthy, cases weren't just functional, they were architectural. Statements, gilded trim, hand-blown glass, etched Latin quotations. Some even had miniature fountains inside, because of course they did. But the case wasn't just a greenhouse, it was a lifeline. Before its invention, many ferns couldn't survive the soot-choked air of cities like Manchester or London. The Wardian case turned urban homes into micro-rhine forests. Now, even if you lived next to a coal factory, you could keep a bit of Eden in your parlour. You just had to mist it, gently, twice a day, and absolutely never let Aunt Edna open it after eating pickled onions. The real kicker? These boxes didn't just preserve ferns. They accelerated the entire colonial plant trade. Suddenly, fragile specimens could be shipped across continents with relative ease. Coffee, rubber, cocoa. Orchids, none of these global movements would have happened quite so efficiently without the Wardian case. You trace your finger along the brass hinge. It's cool to the touch, worn smooth by decades of careful opening. Victorian botanists treated these cases like sacred relics. Some even named theirs Fiona. One diary entry reads, survived the Lisbon crossing with no visible distress. Imagine loving a box so much you give it a travel journal. Quirky tidbit here. At one point, the Royal Horticultural Society had to issue a polite memo asking enthusiasts to please stop building excessively large Wardian cases in public parks. Apparently, one overzealous collector had tried to install a walk-in model near the Serpentine. The idea of keeping a plant locked in glass might sound a little sad, but the Victorians didn't see it that way. They thought they were honoring nature, preserving it, perfecting it. It was like having a window to the tropics on your windowsill. And when visitors came over, oh, the satisfaction of cracking open the lid, letting the dewy rainforest scent escape and watching guests swoon with fond envy. But it wasn't all showmanship. Real discoveries happened, too. Many amateur botanists used Wardian cases to experiment with hybridization. They'd swap spores, track growth patterns, and even crossbreed ferns just to see what would happen. Some of those fern varieties still exist today, faint green fingerprints left by long-dead collectors with too much time and too many tweezers. Historians still argue whether these home experiments should be considered science or just polite indoor meddling. But either way, they mattered. The Wardian case blurred the lines between hobby and laboratory, between the salon and the field. You shift your gaze to a small engraving on the case's side. To LS, may your fronds unfurl with grace. A gift, maybe, a courtship offering. Fern cases were popular among Victorian couples. Forget roses, nothing said I adore you quite like an eternally misted fern in a humidity-controlled box, but the class lines still cut through it all. The wealthy had imported cases from Paris. The middle class had flat-pack versions with adjustable vents. The poor, well, if they had any luck, they might build their own from old picture frames and leftover candle glass. And while some purists scoffed at such improvisations, others admired the dedication. One letter in the Gentlewoman's Companion reads, I have constructed my fernery from what remained of my late husband's greenhouse. It serves well, and he always disliked begonias. You smile? That's the spirit. The sun finally breaks through the clouds outside, casting shifting shadows across the greenhouse floor. The ferns seem to shimmer slightly in the light, like soft green feathers waving from 100 stillbirds. In the Wardian case before you, tiny droplets roll down the inside of the glass, like rain on a train window. It's quiet, peaceful. Just you, a box of moist plants, and the distant creak of floorboards. Sometimes you think history isn't about wars or kings. Sometimes it's about a fern in a box. You're out of the greenhouse again now, boots back in the mud, breath curling in the cool morning air. Today's agenda: fern hunting, not a gentle amble. Mind you know, you're heading out on what Victorians fondly referred to as botanical excursions, and what any sane person would call botanical boot camps. You trudge along a narrow country lane, a canvas satchel bouncing at your hip. Inside, a hand lens, a sketchbook, a trowel, and 3 spare pairs of socks. You'll need them, because you are not just going on a walk. You are embarking on a fern quest. It sounds idyllic, an afternoon in the woods, perhaps the trickle of a brook, some polite conversation about the Latin name of a leaf. But don't be fooled. These leisurely outings were marathons in disguise. The true fern hunter rose at dawn, endured swampy bogs, steep crags, unexpected cattle, and the occasional low-hanging wasp nest, for the sake of a particularly well-formed Aetherium filix femina. You might find yourself dangling by one boot from a rock ledge, which, let's face it, does not appear on the postcard. You follow a footpath through a shady wood now, dappled sunlight breaking through a ceiling. Evokes. The air smells like moss and wet stone, and there just ahead is your quarry. Nestled in the crook of a crumbling wall, a graceful polystich immaculatum. You drop to your knees with reverent urgency, brushing aside ivy. Its fronds are bright green, each leaflet toothed like the edge of a serrated knife. You hold your breath and reach for your lens. Now here's the catch. According to Victorian etiquette, you must never collect a fern that's too fine. Such specimens should be admired, sketched, perhaps even whispered to, but never removed. After all, what would happen if everyone took the best ones? No, it was far more fashionable to take a humble, slightly battered fern and coax it back to perfection at home. It showed you had both patience and horticultural virtue. Historians still argue whether this unspoken rule was a genuine conservation effort or just another way to feel superior at garden parties. In one of the more obscure Fern Club manuals, there's an entire chapter dedicated to the ethics of frond removal. It advises gently loosening soil with a copper spoon, singing softly while harvesting, and if possible apologizing to the fern before departure. No one said Victorian collectors lacked drama. Back in the woods, a bird calls out overhead. You pause to make a quick sketch of your find, noting its placement: east-facing wall, high drainage, light dapple. Your handwriting is cramped, your nose is running, and a beetle just wandered across your page, but it's all part of the charm. The 19th century saw the rise of the fern hunting party, organized groups who would take the train out of the city, disembark at a likely stop, and immediately disappear into hedgerows with maps, baskets, and that fierce, silent determination usually reserved for Victorian board games. These trips were often co-ed, which gave them a slightly thrilling, mildly scandalous air. A young lady might accidentally brush fingers with a fellow collector. While reaching for a frond gasp, courtships bloomed among the bracken. You pass. An older gentleman on the trail, now bowler hat, boots, tread cheeks, who tips his hat and holds up a modest specimen like a trophy. Setter acaphysenarum. He wheezes proudly before vanishing into the underbrush. You wonder if he's eaten. Probably not. One curious fringe fact: ferns were occasionally hunted by torchlight. Yes, torchlight. Nighttime excursions became popular among more eccentric enthusiasts who believed that nocturnal dew enhanced frond luster. No one could ever prove this, but several ruined shoes and one notable lawsuit involving a cliff and a borrowed lantern later. The practice fell out of favor. Your trail takes a steeper turn. You grab a branch for balance and clamber up, heart pounding, knees damp. At the summit, there's an outcropping of rocks, and yes, nestled in a damp crevice, a rare curly-edged fern. Possibly Asplenium viride. It's a bit shy, peeking out. From behind a stone, but you spot it. Triumph swells in your chest. You're winded, soaked, and gently bleeding from a bramble scratch, but it's worth it. The Victorians believed in the moral benefits of collecting. It wasn't just about the plants, it was about the transformation. A quiet man became adventurous. A proper lady became daring. In one charming diary entry from 1867, a schoolteacher named Mary Eliza writes, "Today, I scaled a slope I would not have dared last year, all for the sake of my dryopteras. I am proud, also saw, you pause beside a brook now, pulling a damp sandwich from your satchel. It's mashed and mostly lettuce, but you chew happily, watching water ripple over stones. A frog hops into view, then out again. Somewhere nearby, another fern hunter coughs politely in the undergrowth. There's camaraderie here, shared mud, mutual respect, the nod of acknowledgement as two strangers pass on opposite sides of a gully, both pretending they aren't eyeing each other's baskets. Of course, some fern hunters were intense. Henry Lacey, a known enthusiast from Kent, reportedly spent 3 weeks in a marsh becoming one with the reeds to track a rumoured new hybrid. He returned triumphant, if slightly waterlogged. His journal contains the line, "The fern was glorious. I am still itchy." You rise at last, wiping your hands on your coat and shouldering your bag. Your specimens, wrapped in damp cloth and tucked between book pages, rustle as you walk. Each one feels like a victory, a small, leafy reward for perseverance and blisters. And as the woods fade behind you and a train whistle sounds in the distance, you think, for all its quirks, all its muddy discomforts and social pageantry, fern hunting really does feel like a kind of magic. You arrive home as the gas lamps flicker to life across the street and the last streaks of sunlight fade behind a line of chimney pots. Your boots are mud-caked, your coat damp, but your spirits positively buoyant, because nestled in your satchel are 5 freshly collected fronds, each carefully wrapped in damp paper and humming with potential. You step into your parlour still misty with the warm breath of your Wardian case, and place your satchel beside a low table already cluttered, with labels, quills, and a half-drunk cup of cold tea. A portrait of Queen Victoria frowns at you from above the mantelpiece. You nod back respectfully, and now you enter one of the most delightfully peculiar subplots of the fern craze. The rise of the ladies with loops, the refined, corseted, determined women who turned fern collecting into a quiet, botanical revolution. Victorian England didn't exactly encourage women to stomp through wetlands or scale cliffs, but ferns are. Ferns were respectable, they were chaste, they didn't flower and thus didn't carry awkward metaphors, and best of all, they offered intellectual engagement without drawing suspicion. Studying ferns allowed women to dabble in science, field work, and social connection without the scandal of, say, enrolling in university or forming opinions in public. You sit now at a small wooden desk as a woman, perhaps Miss Eliza Dorrington, spinster of 32, and proud subscriber to the Ladies' Botanical Monthly, lays out her freshly gathered specimens. Her hands are steady, her fingers ink-stained from recent labelling. She's dressed in a high-collared blouse with sleeves rolled just enough to suggest danger. On the desk, a small brass loop glints under the lamplight. She selects a frond, holds it up to the lens and peers closely at its underside. Rows of tiny brown dots stare back at her sporangia. These are the fern's reproductive structures, packed with microscopic spores. Here's your mainstream historical fact of the evening. Victorian women didn't just collect ferns. They studied their reproduction, catalogued them, and debated their classifications in published letters and botanical society minutes. While men published books, women filled personal albums beautiful, meticulous, and often more accurate than anything in print. In some cases, their work was essential. Eleanor Ormerod, for example, began as a fern collector and later became Britain's first major female entomologist. Her early fern journals include pages of tightly inked observation measurements, growth habits, and experimental soil notes, and one delightful aside complaining about squirrels. Historians still argue whether these women were passive hobbyists or active pioneers, whose contributions were undervalued, simply because they wore skirts. The truth, as always, lies in the mossy middle dot back in the parlour. Miss Dorrington arranges her fronds on crisp paper sheets, ready for pressing. Her album, already thick with specimens, rests open beside her. Each page contains a mounted fern, a careful ink drawing of the full plant, and a note about where it was found. Some pages contain pressed flowers or penciled birds spotted nearby. This isn't just a record, it's a diary disguised as science. A quirky tidbit for you: Victorian young ladies sometimes used fern albums as social tokens. A well-curated page might be offered as a gift, an invitation, or even whispered a mild flirtation. One especially romantic soul glued her initials in spores beneath a Dryopteris dilatata and presented it to a Mr. Havisham of Sheffield. He reportedly swooned, but it may have been pollen allergies. You reach now for a pamphlet on the desk, A Lady's Guide to Fern Cultivation, published 1874. Inside are firm but gentle instructions: always use a silver knife, avoid direct sunlight, mist daily but never overwater. If your fern droops, speak kindly to it. If it still droops, consider spiritual causes. It's part botany guide, part emotional support document. And make no mistake, there was competition among these gentlewomen. Quiet, yes. Polite, of course, but cutthroat. In lace gloves, absolutely. Miss Dorrington once told a neighbour she'd found a slightly mottled aetherium down in Holton Wood. The next morning, 3 women appeared at the site, baskets in hand, hats askew. One lost a shoe. Another reportedly hissed. Some women, frustrated by the limits of polite society, pushed boundaries. One Miss Isabel Firth took to disguising herself in her brother's overcoat and had to access fern sites deemed too rugged for ladies. She signed her findings I, Firth, Isk, and was published twice before anyone figured out she wore petticoats. Meanwhile, fern societies began hosting ladies' evenings, where albums were exchanged, species debated, and cake served. There was, of course, a prize for most tasteful arrangement. Unspoken rules applied. Don't mount too many exotic ferns, it reads as showy. Always hand-labeled printing is impersonal. And for heaven's sake, no glue blobs. You examine Miss Dorrington's hands again. There's a small ink blot on her wrist, and the cuticle of her left thumb is a little frayed. These are the hands of someone who has spent long hours in mossy shade, kneeling in skirts, sketching by lantern light. Someone who will wake tomorrow and check the misting on her adianum before boiling the kettle. Historians still debate whether fern collecting was empowering or ornamental, but tonight, as lamplight glows golden on the wood and the soft tick of a clock breaks the silence, you suspect it was both. Miss Dorrington leans back, stretches her arms, and looks out the window. A neighbour across the way is also up late, perhaps labelling spores under candlelight. You imagine a subtle competition whose Triscretica will last the winter, whose will wither in shame. Outside, a fox slinks past the fence. Inside, the air smells of lavender sachets, parchment, and the faint earthy sweetness of drying leaves. You close the album, careful not to crinkle the pages, and ease yourself into a well-worn chair. The room is quiet. The work is done. The ferns, for now, are still. The next morning dawns grey and damp, the sort of day that causes your joints to mutter, and the ferns to absolutely thrive. You slip into your boots, still bearing the crusty memory of yesterday's excursion, and step outside with a thermos of weak tea in one hand and a sense of creeping dread in the other. Because today you're visiting one of the least talked about and yet endlessly fascinating features of the Victorian fern craze: mossy rivalries. You make your way through a quiet village path, hedged with brambles and nettles, toward a small woodland clearing that, according to rumour, contains a rare and fiercely protected patch of Asplenium adianum nigrum. But as you reach the fence, you notice something odd. A handwritten sign, nailed roughly to the gate, reads in perfectly curt script: "Ferns herein observed and not to be disturbed." Chilver, you glance around. No one in sight, but you feel watched. Welcome to the underground turf walls of the Victorian fern world where enthusiastic amateurs jealously guarded. They're collecting spots like secret treasure maps. These were mossy micro-territories staked out with a mixture of passive-aggressive signage, politely worded letters to local newspapers and in at least 2 recorded cases. Fistfights involving walking sticks. Historians still argue whether fern hunters had any legal or moral claim to the cliffs, gullies, and abandoned churchyards they considered their personal supply zones. But to the Victorians, possession was 9/10 of prestige. If you found it first, you named it first, and heaven help anyone who dared trespass. You follow a winding trail deeper into the wood, eyes scanning the low stone walls and shaded crevices for any sign of green treasure. You find a small stand of ferns and labeled wild, beautiful. But there's also a rock nearby with initials carved into it, JT 1864. It's a fern collector's calling card. You've stumbled into someone else's patch. These rivalries weren't always hostile, but they were very, very personal. Ferns were quiet trophies. Collectors took immense pride in having exclusive rights to particular shady nooks or mossy hollows, passed down like heirlooms or whispered over brandy after dinner. A gentleman might even bring a visitor to his secret fern spot, blindfolded. Yes, really, blindfolded. That's how serious this got. There's a story, possibly apocryphal, of a young woman named Beatrice Winthrop who invited her rival, Lillian, on a collecting trip. Lillian took a shortcut and arrived first at a known trichomanes hotspot, collecting 3 specimens and accidentally trampling the rest. Beatrice reportedly never spoke to her again and went on to publish a spiteful pamphlet titled The Etiquette of Frond Selection. You kneel by a stream now and spot a particularly fetching specimen, but you hesitate. There's a painted stone nearby with the words private observation area. It's absurd, but you feel guilt anyway. You walk on. One particularly prickly feud played out in the letters pages of the Quarterly Fern Journal, in which two collectors known only by their initials, R.W. and H.F., waged a year-long passive-aggressive war of words over the exact classification of a hybrid found near Crickhow Well. At one point, R.W. wrote, H.F.'s specimen resembles less a fern and more an overcooked leek. A quirky tidbit from the period: some collectors trained their dogs to sniff out ferns. A spaniel named Pickle became briefly famous in Devon for his uncanny ability to locate spleenwort, though his legacy was later marred when he enthusiastically destroyed an entire fern bed chasing a vole. You pass a weathered milestone and arrive at what appears to be a forgotten estate garden. A wrought iron gate stands open, rusted and quiet. Ivy coils around the archway, and within you see an overgrown grotto, its stones slick with algae, and in the very center, on a ledge just out of reach Asplenium septentrionale. You glance around. No signs. No initials. No obvious territorial markers. Is it possible this one's unclaimed? You step forward, snap a quick sketch, just as you reach for your notebook. A voice floats out from the foliage behind you. Ah, I thought someone might come poking about today. You turn to see an elderly woman in a tweed cloak, holding a walking stick with a carved fern frond at the top. Her expression is polite, her tone cool. Lovely little specimen, she says, stepping up beside you. But I've been monitoring the patch since 1879. You blink. Ah, you reply. Of course, I'd never. No harm done, she says with a smile that feels both genuine and subtly territorial. But do take care not to step on the Ceterac behind you. They're a touch delicate this season. You back away as gracefully as one can while sinking into moss. She tips her hat and vanishes back into the trees, leaving only the faint scent of camphor and authority. You scribble a note in your field journal. Don't trust the grotto. It's someone's. This was the paradox of pterodomania it celebrated. Nature, but it did not always share it. The era's most devoted fern lovers often treated wilderness like a private museum, with each niche and crevice catalogued, defended, and occasionally booby-trapped with guilt. Still, you can't help but smile as you retrace your steps, because even though the rivalries were real, the obsession they revealed was somehow tender. There's something endearing about a world where the biggest conflicts were about spores, where insults involved Latin mispronunciations, and where scandal took the shape of an unauthorized clipping dot as you pass back through the village. You glance at another tidy garden, its low wall trailing with ivy and a single fern standing tall in the corner. No signs. No initials, just a frond unfurling gently in the breeze, claiming its own patch of earth without fuss. You walk on, careful not to step on any moss. You wouldn't want to start a war. Back in town, you stop by a small storefront tucked between a bakery and a bookseller. The painted sign overhead reads, P. Marsh and Sons Fern Books, Front Prints and Framing. A bell tinkles as you open the door, and you're met with the warm scent of old paper, printer's ink and dried plant matter. Welcome to the print-crazy underbelly of Pteridumania world where ferns weren't just grown, studied or thought over, but also obsessively drawn, printed, pressed, and reproduced in more forms than you'd think possible for something with no flowers inside. Shelves sag under the weight of dozens, no, hundreds of books devoted entirely to ferns. Field guides, taxonomic catalogues, sketchbooks, poetry compilations, and even instructional volumes on the moral interpretation of frond posture. You walk past titles like Fronds of the Field, The Domestic Fernist, and one slim little volume called The Soul of Sorry, a meditation. Historians still argue whether this explosion of fern-related publications was born from genuine academic enthusiasm or simply fed the consumer frenzy, but either way, it created a golden age of fern imagery. You flip through a thick portfolio of botanical illustrations. Each page is a masterclass in detail. Engraved copperplate etchings of ferns, printed in soft sepia tones with delicate shading and impossibly fine lines. Every pinner, every tiny spore cluster rendered with such precision it almost breathes. These weren't just diagrams, they were love letters, and not just in scientific journals, oh no. Ferns made their way into everything: greeting cards, wallpaper, fabric patterns, lampshades, calling cards and sheet music covers. There's even a lithograph on the wall behind the shop counter, a foppish young man offering a fern frond to a blushing lady beneath the words, "Take this token, modest yet true." It's basically the Victorian version of sending someone a fern emoji. One quirky tidbit: there was a short-lived but enthusiastic trend for fernograms, postal notes decorated with real pressed fronds. They often arrived mangled, but that was part of the charm. You lean over a glass case near the register, where an original print of a Blecknim spigot glows under the lamplight. The sign beside it reads, hand-colored, 1862. Rare misprint frond rendered upside down. Even errors were collectible. A small framed pamphlet on the wall catches your eye on the artistic morality of ferns, published by the Society for the Aesthetic Arrangement of Botanical Forms. Its central argument, that ferns in there, balanced symmetry and lack of vulgar display, represented the highest ideal of Victorian virtue. It concludes with the phrase, "To love a fern is to choose a life of order and grace." A bold claim, but oddly soothing dot behind the counter. The shopkeeper a gaunt man with the look of someone who dreams in decimal classification nods. As you admire a particularly intricate woodcut, "That one's from the Lacey collection," he murmurs. "Took the artist 9 weeks. Had to wait for the exact right do pattern to catch the light properly." You blink. "He drew." "Do? Oh yes." He says. "Twice." The artistic obsession extended beyond the bookshelves, too. Fern prints were framed and hung in salons, offices, and even bedrooms. There was a distinct style known as fernery. Minimalism, where one perfect frond was centered on a vast blank page, a sort of leafy Victorian zen. Even Queen Victoria reportedly had a fern sketch hung near her writing desk. You flip through another book, Ferns and Their Shadows, which explores not the plants themselves, but the shapes they cast on paper, fabric, and frosted windows. It's subtitled A Treatise on Elegance, and it wasn't just amateurs. Professional artists got involved, too. William Kilburn, known for his textile patterns, produced a fern-themed series that sold out in weeks. Entire rooms were wallpapered in rolling waves of ferns, bedrooms, drawing rooms, and even libraries. Imagine trying to focus on your reading while hundreds of tiny green fronds waved quietly behind your head. But here's where it gets weirder. Some enthusiasts took the idea of fern art a little too literally. They were attempts at fern performance art, including a short-lived theatre production called The Whispering Frond, which featured a man in green satin reciting poetry while crouching under a giant paper fern. It received mixed reviews, mostly polite coughing. You browse a final shelf near the door labeled amateur albums. These are hand-bound books made by everyday Victorians, men, women, and children, filled with pressed specimens, sketches, clippings, and handwritten notes. Some are neat and methodical, others chaotic and joyful. On one page, a child has written in thick pencil, "Found this one near the cow. She chased me. Worth it." Historians still debate whether these home albums were true science or just scrapbooking with spores, but they give you a glimpse into real life's moments of curiosity, pride, and often very damp shoes dot as you leave the shop, arms full of pamphlets and prints. You realize just how far the fern had crept into the Victorian imagination. It wasn't just a plant. It was a motif, a message, a movement. Something about those ancient, unfurling fronds whispered of mystery, of elegance, of time itself. And as the door swings shut behind you, bell jingling once more, you wonder if someone ever pressed you between the pages of history. What shape would you leave behind? You're sitting in the back corner of a dimly lit hall now, the kind with polished floorboards, high ceilings, and a faint lingering smell of lemon oil and anxious perspiration. The chairs are arranged in orderly rows, and at the front, a large table is draped in green velvet. You clutch a folded paper in your lap. Tonight's lecture, the spleenwood spectrum variation. Or vexation? Welcome to one of the most treasured traditions of Fern fandom, the Fern Society meeting. It's a surprisingly lively scene by Victorian standards, anyway. There's murmuring. There are biscuits. Someone in the front row is adjusting a monocle, with the steely determination of a man preparing for battle. And around you, the members of the local Pteridological Society are gathering with serious intent, and an almost religious reverence for taxonomy. Fern societies began cropping up across Britain in the mid-1800s like spores drifting into fertile minds. Some were affiliated with natural history museums, others were private clubs. A few met in the homes of prominent members, while others rented out parish halls like this one, where pews were swapped for pamphlets and tea was compulsory. You watch as a woman in a dark blue dress unpacks a velvet-lined box filled with pressed fronds. They're mounted on ivory card, labeled in copperplate handwriting, and arranged in precise sequence. One even has an asterisk specimen believed to be intermediate. Form, possibly spontaneous hybrid. People are already craning their necks to glimpse it. And here's your mainstream historical fact. By the late 1800s, Britain had over a dozen regional fern societies, including the famous British Pteridological Society, which still exists today. These groups organized field trips, published journals, hosted exhibitions, and maintained rigorous debates over, well, everything. Tonight's speaker clears his throat and taps the podium twice. Ladies and gentlemen, he begins, and esteemed frond enthusiasts, there's a chuckle, a polite one but heartfelt. His subject tonight, the tricky classification of Asplenium hybrids. The issue, they just won't behave in the wild. Hybrids crop up unexpectedly, resist tidy categorization, and often blur the lines between established species. A botanical nuisance or a scientific thrill, depending on who you ask. Historians still argue whether Victorian fern scholars made genuine strides in hybridization, research, or just enthusiastically mislabeled everything. The debates were endless. Was Asplenium times alternifolium a stable hybrid or merely wishful thinking? Did it originate from natural cross-pollination? Or was someone overzealous with their notebook and glue? During one particularly heated exchange in 1876, a speaker at the Yorkshire Fern Society declared a rival's hybrid claims no more substantial than fog in a bottle. He was not invited back the following year. You glance at the table of reference materials beside the lectern. There's Hooker's British Ferns, an absolute cornerstone of Victorian botany, its leather spine cracked and loved. Beside it, Ferns for Beginners, complete with a foreword assuring the reader that no prior botanical training or Latin fluency is required, though both are strongly advised. A quirky tidbit: some fern societies required formal dress and a secret password for admission. The Torquay Frond Fellowship's password in 1878 was reportedly "sorry forever." Take that as you adopt the lecturer pauses now to display a dried hybrid specimen under glass. From the back, it looks like a very polite stick insect. People lean forward, some squinting through opera glasses. There's a murmur of interest, a scattered applause. Then comes the cue and a portion of battlefield disguised as polite inquiry. A man with a large mustache stands. "Sir," he says, "your assertion that the Atrichomanes ramosum cross holds firm over 3 generations. On what basis?" The speaker smiles thinly. "On the basis, sir, of observation, patience, and, if I may say so, superior drainage." The audience titters. The mustache man sits in a far corner. To elderly ladies pass a note back and forth. It's later revealed to be a sketch of a frond wearing spectacles. The caption reads, "Professor Fernstein, Ph.D. potted." These meetings were as much social clubs as scientific symposiums. Friendships formed over frond comparisons. Courtships began beside display tables. Long-running rivalries simmered quietly between those who preferred Blecknams to polystichons. The divisions were real, and sometimes they escalated. One now legendary incident involved a disputed Dryopterus display at a national exhibition. One party claimed it had been mislabeled. The other party retaliated by removing all the labels from every fern on the table, forcing judges to guess by sight alone. Chaos ensued. A small fern fell. A monocle was lost. A woman fainted. Fern drama. And yet for all the tensions there was joy here. Shared knowledge. Earnest curiosity. A collective belief that ferns mattered. That they were beautiful. Yes, but also worthy of serious study. As the lecture winds down, the speaker holds up a single frond. "It may appear simple," he says, "but within this structure lies everything: beauty, complexity, adaptability." The fern does not shout, it unfurls. A few people wipe their eyes. You step out into the night air, your breath clouding gently as the hall door closes behind you. In your pocket, a program listing next month's topic: moisture and morality. Can you overwater the soul? You smile, and as you walk home, you imagine the thousands of frond lovers who came before you, who sat in stiff chairs, sipped lukewarm tea, and earnestly debated Latin names under gaslight. They weren't chasing fame or fortune, just knowledge, camaraderie, a deeper understanding of something quiet and green and lovely, and perhaps, just perhaps, the hope that one day someone would find their old pressed album and say, "Yes, this mattered." You awaken early too early. If we're being honest, and today you're heading somewhere altogether different, not to a forest, a garden, or a drawing room, but into the hushed marble corridors of a place where knowledge is stacked to the ceilings. A Victorian museum, specifically the botanical wing of a natural history museum. Circa 1882, you step inside, wiping the city grit from your boots, and immediately the air changes. Cooler, drier, scented faintly of varnish, pressed parchment, and distant, repressed ambition. The fern section is tucked toward the rear, beyond rows of glass cases filled with curious shells, taxidermied rodents, and one disturbingly toothy fossil that looks like it wants to tell you a secret. But finally, you reach it, a gleaming display case of mounted fronds, each flattened and labeled in precise, looping copperplate. The lighting is dim, but the ferns themselves are immaculate, some local, some collected from as far away as Tasmania. This is where fern collecting gets truly official. You're in the realm of the curated specimen, the scientific record, the classified and catalogued. No crushed albums here. These are botanical trophies, each one a silent survivor of someone's field work, someone's moment of discovery in the moss. Mainstream historical fact. Most major Victorian museums had botany departments that housed thousands upon thousands of dried specimens, often sent in from British colonies. Ferns were some of the most common inclusions, easier to preserve than flowers. less finicky than moss and conveniently uncontroversial. You lean closer to the case and examine a sheet, bearing a Platycerium bifurcatum, the famed stag fern. Its antler-like lobes curve outward dramatically, and the placard underneath reads, "Donated by Rev. H. N. Blackwell, collected near Port Jackson, 1865. You imagine the Reverend in a sun-faded cassock, swatting flies and muttering about frond angles. But for every mounted marvel, there are drawers. Endless drawers. A museum employee hair in a sensible bun. Spectacles perched halfway down her nose guides you to the archives. With a gloved hand, she slides open one long, creaking cabinet. Inside are folders thousands each containing a single dried plant, each labeled, dated, and often accompanied by a small handwritten note. Scolopendrium vulgare, north face of Corey. Found while fleeing geese, Polypodium virginianum. Odd bluish tint. Collector unsure if fern or error. Adianum capillus veneris, fragile. Do not shake box. A quirky tidbit. Some collectors left marginal doodles tiny. Inked ferns with faces, umbrellas, or in one mysterious case, a monocle and a cane. Either a whimsical flourish or evidence of a long afternoon stuck in the rain. Historians still debate whether the museums of the era saw fern specimens as vital scientific resources or simply botanical filler. One curator allegedly described them as the polite background noise of the herbarium, but whether celebrated or sidelined, they endure dry, crisp, persistent. You follow the archivist to another room, this one more chaotic. A back chamber filled with unsorted donations, correspondence, and a dreaded specimens awaiting classification shelves. Here, ferns lie loosely wrapped in tissue paper, some faded, some surprisingly vibrant. A faded note atop one pile reads, "To be determined," possibly a child's. Drawing. You don't doubt it. Among these papers lies a small field diary. Its cover stained and soft at the edges. You flip it open. The entries are simple, observational, but oddly poetic. Rained again. Found A. rutimeraria near stone post. Looked. Lonely. Climbed ridge. Bruised shin. Still worth it. Forgot sandwich. Traded it for frond. This is the quiet beauty of the museum, the lives between the labels. Every pressed specimen has a human behind it. Someone who knelt in the mud, wrestled with a stubborn root, or got sunburned on a limestone cliff. All for the sake of a leaf. You take a seat near a display of exotic ferns from Ceylon and Trinidad, their fronds arranged like fans on dark velvet. Victorians were fascinated by the foreign fern, part botanical interest, part imperial curiosity. The more delicate, alien, or moisture-demanding the plant, the more desirable it was to the museum or the drawing room. Some specimens arrived labeled in languages. The curators didn't speak. Some arrived mislabeled entirely. One museum mistakenly listed a banana leaf as fern, possibly carnivorous. That label remained for 5 years. And then there's the Wardian case. Yes, they're here too. In the center of the room, an antique terrarium sits under spotlight, its glass fogged slightly. Ferns within still green. The placard reads, "In continuous growth since 1868. Watered once. Lid never opened." You can't help but lean closer. The silence inside is almost spiritual. You imagine the first person who ever laid eyes on this little world, who closed the lid, trusting nature to balance itself. That moment of quiet faith that a leaf might grow without interferences. The very heart of what Pterodomania, for all its oddities, longed for, a bit of wildness preserved. As you leave the museum, stepping back into the clatter of carriages and chatter outside, you carry with you the hush of those long drawers, the rustle of pressed paper, and the lingering feeling that somewhere, behind a locked cabinet, a fern is still slowly, stubbornly unfurling. Today you're not in the forest, or a hall, or even a museum. Today, you're standing in the parlor of a very grand Victorian home, a home with high ceilings, crimson wallpaper, and the strong smell of polish on the floorboards, because tonight we're stepping into the elegant, slightly ridiculous, utterly obsessive world of the upper-class fern room. Yes, fern rooms. Not gardens, not greenhouses, but full indoor rooms devoted entirely to ferns. These weren't your average potted plant corners. No, this was status foliage. You brush past a velvet curtain and enter a space transformed, cool, misty and deeply humid. The air smells of damp earth and ambition. Ferns are everywhere, tucked into stone troughs, trailing from hanging baskets, erupting from ornate urns perched on Grecian pedestals. The windows are half shuttered to keep out the scorching shame of direct sunlight. This room is a shrine to chlorophyll. Victorian high society had a thing for spectacle, and the indoor fern room became one of its favorite flourishes. What better way to show off your wealth, taste, and understanding of exotic horticulture than by turning part of your house into a miniature jungle? Mainstream historical fact. By the 1870s, fern rooms were fixtures in many aristocratic homes. They were featured in design catalogues, celebrated in house tours, and even shown off in popular magazines like the Gardener's Chronicle. If you were really someone, your fern room had a water feature. Of course, they weren't entirely practical. One Lady Bartlesham reportedly spent more on misting systems than on servants' wages. Her fern room included imported soil, 3 species from Java, and a tiny waterfall powered by a child-sized treadmill. Her nephew's punishment for poor Latin scores. And let's not forget the Wardian cases, those lovely, sealed glass environments that kept the air moist and judgment high. A proper fern room had several, usually centered on particularly dramatic specimens. One guest described a display case in the home of Lord Quigley as looking rather like a coffin. If coffins contained a rainforest and deep emotional need, historians still argue whether these fern rooms were genuine botanical interest or simply leafy social theatre. Were the hosts actually fascinated with taxonomy, or were they mostly eager for compliments on their Lygodian japonicum? The answer may lie somewhere between ego and spores. A quirky tidbit: some households employed fern valets, yes, fern valets whose job it was to mist, prune, and occasionally rotate the ferns for even growth. One such valet reportedly quit after an argument over aesthetic asymmetry in a pot arrangement. Passion runs deep in the plant world. You stroll further into the room. A Persian rug is damp from overwatering. A marble statue of Venus has had a creeping fern trained up her arm. A harpsichord in the corner sits idle except for the pot of Nuphrolabis exultata, blooming atop its keys. This room was once for music and conversation. Now, it's for silence and photosynthesis. You pause before a particularly grand urn containing a staghorn fern the size of a small dog. Its fronds sprawl upward like antlers reaching for aristocratic approval. A small brass plaque on the pedestal reads, "Gifted by Sir Thomas Abernathy, 1869. Watered hourly." Hourly. You suspect this plant may have been better hydrated than most of Victorian London. There's something absurdly soothing about all this effort: the misting schedules, the soil debates, the endless repositioning of urns based on perceived humidity, gradients, and yet it's kind of beautiful here in a society that prized control and order. The fern offered a soft rebellion. It demanded mist, shade, silence. It could not be rushed. It could not be flaunted to loudly. And when these upper-class hosts threw their salons or musical evenings, you can be sure the fern room was part of the itinerary. After the pianoforte, we shall take tea among the fronds. Elegant guests would stroll through, nodding politely at each plant like they were visiting distant, leafy cousins. One woman reportedly described her fern room as the only place. I may breathe without corset or commentary. You feel that. But make no mistake, there was competition here too. Hostesses prided themselves on their rare specimens, their symmetrical arrangements, their carefully curated displays of green. A poorly trimmed fern could spell social ruin. One scandalized letter from 1881 reads, "Mrs. Enfield's Adianum appeared sadly parched. I could not finish my sherry." You examine a side table piled high with fern-related reading. The Illustrated Fern Keeper's Companion, How to Speak to Your Fronds, and Humidity, A Gentlewoman's Guide, all very serious. all exquisitely bound in leather dot, and yet beneath the wealth, beneath the polished brass misting cans and imported volcanic gravel, there's a kind of yearning here. The Fern room is not just decoration, it's a retreat, a place where you don't have to perform. You just sit, you listen, and you let the green grow around you. You take a seat in an overstuffed chair near the rear window. The glass is fogged, the lamplight soft. Around you, the ferns sway slightly in a breeze you can't quite place. The room is quite safe for the gentle hiss of the hidden humidifier and the creak of old wood shifting in its sleep. You close your eyes for a moment and imagine what it must have felt like to live here corseted, mannered, watch-tanned to escape into this leafy sanctuary, to breathe without lace, to unfurl, just like the ferns. You won't stay long. The drawing room awaits, and someone is bound to start reciting Tennyson soon. But for now, for these few misty moments, you're alone among the fronds, and it is blissfully, quietly perfect. It's late afternoon now, and you're standing in a place less formal, less polished though no less important to the Fern saga. The light slants lazily through the clouds as you approach the crumbling stone edge of an old churchyard, one of the unsung battlegrounds of pterodomania. Victorian fern collectors had a knack for turning up in unexpected places, and churchyards were among their favorites. Cool, shaded, often built on uneven terrain with centuries-old walls, ideal microclimates for many native species. You push open a wrought iron gate that squeals in protest. Beyond it lies a sloping graveyard dotted with leaning headstones, ivy-clad. Obelisks and the occasional angel, arms forever raised in resignation. Birds chirp half-heartedly from the yews, and a breeze stirs the tall grasses between graves. You've come to visit the walls, not for ghosts or epitaphs, but for the lush, defiant green of wall ferns, growing in the cracks between stone and lime, outlasting both rain and reverence. Mainstream historical fact. Churchyards across the British Isles became hotspots for fern hunting in the 19th century, particularly for species like Asplenium rudimeraria, Seta acofficinarum, and wall rue. Their knack for thriving in crevices turned old burial grounds into unintentional botanical preserves. You run your fingers along a sun-warmed gravestone and see it there, a tiny, perfect frond waving gently from a crack between the base and the surrounding path. You crouch for a better look. It's somehow both delicate and fierce, like a green whisper pushing back against time. And of course, you're not the first to admire it. Victorian fern enthusiasts were notorious for clambering over ancient tombs, in pursuit of prime specimens, often to the horror of the more pious. One clergyman wrote in 1863, "It has become impossible to deliver a sermon without witnessing some bonneted lady with a parasol attempting to extract spleenwort from the northern wall." Historians still argue whether this behavior reflected a spiritual connection to nature, or a total disregard for resting places. Some parishes banned collecting outright. Others simply posted polite notices, "No picking of ferns from sacred grounds, the dead thank you." You pass by one of these signs, faded now, its message lost to rain. Around it, ferns flourish as if to say, "Nice try." And here's your quirky tidbit. Several Victorian children's books included illustrations of graveyard botanists, often little girls in pinafores and bonnets, carefully snipping ferns from stone walls, while ghostly figures looked on approvingly. Comforting? Slightly. Morbid? Certainly. Very on brand for the Victorians. You make your way toward the rear wall, where the oldest stones lean together like gossipy old relatives. The gaps between them are lush with Asplenium trichomanes, and a few creeping mosses. One stone has been almost entirely swallowed by greenery, its name lost to spores and silence. You wonder, did the person buried here like ferns? Did they ever know their grave would become a hot spot for amateur botanists in ankle boots and pince nez? You step carefully over a fallen branch and spot a small bundle of papers tucked between two stones, weathered, bound with twine. You carefully extract it and unfold a few sheets. Fern pressings. Nothing labeled, just pressed and placed carefully, lovingly, a silent offering. You tuck it back where you found it. Some secrets are better left mossy. This churchyard, like so many across Britain, became a kind of accidental fernery, while grand estates flaunted their exotic imports here in the cracks of sacred stone. Humble native ferns thrive quietly admired, sometimes stolen, always resilient. You reach a bench near the light gate and sit. A squirrel rustles nearby, disturbed by your presence. The sky shifts, softening to evening tones. There's a calm here, a peace that's not forced but earned. You glance down at your boots muddy again and realize how much ground you've covered in pursuit of these quiet, leafy lives. From drawing rooms to dripping woods, museum drawers to iron railings. And now here, where roots dig into silence and memory. The Victorians may have argued over species names and light levels, but in these places they often found something deeper, a moment of stillness, a sense of continuity, the understanding that long after ambition fades, and names blur on stone, the ferns remain. One 1870s letter reads, "I found a rare spleenwort yesterday, growing directly from the chancel wall. I did not pick it. I merely sat and watched it for some time. It seemed very certain of itself." You think about that, the certainty of a fern. No fanfare, no bloom, just a patient unfolding, a quiet persistence. And as the light continues to dim and the shadows of headstones stretch across the grass, you stand, brush off your coat, and take one last look at the moss-covered wall. Somewhere behind it, a fox moves softly. A bell tolls. In the distance, and from a high crevice, a front waves good night. You're seated now in a stiff-backed chair in a modest sitting room, the kind that smells faintly of paraffin and slightly overboiled cabbage. The tea has gone tepid. A cat is eyeing you from under the settee, but you're not here for conversation or cucumber sandwiches. You're here for something far more thrilling. A look at someone's private fern album, because while grand gardens and fern rooms got all the attention, the real heart of pterodomania often lived between two sheets of buckram and string. This particular album is worn at the corners, but lovingly kept. A small embossed plate on the cover reads, "Miss Henrietta W. Gadsworth, 1875. The spine creaks gently as you open it, and just like that, you're inside another world. The first page is careful, almost shy. One perfect frond of Asplenium scolopendrium, pressed flat, stem aligned precisely with the binding. Beneath it, a note, found near Aunt's gate, slightly bruised, still lovely." Victorians of all classes created these albums. Some were grand, some humble, but all had the same purpose, to catalogue, preserve, and quietly adore the delicate perfection of ferns. Mainstream historical fact: fern albums became wildly popular during the fern craze, often given as gifts, passed down through families, or swapped among collectors like trading cards made of chlorophyll. You flip carefully through the pages. Here's a lacy adianum, featherlight and fragile. Over there, a proud polystitchum. It's note reading, discovered in fog, slipped twice, but it's more than just botany. There's storytelling here, collected after the storm's still dripping, found during argument, mood lifted. This one followed me home, figuratively. Each frond a little emotional timestamp. You imagine Miss Gadsworth, bonnet askew, kneeling in the mud with ink-stained fingers, carefully sliding each specimen into wax paper. And these weren't mass-produced albums. Many were handmade. The paper was often linen or cotton rag acid-free, if you were lucky. The pressing process involved blotting paper, weights, and patience. Some enthusiasts kept their ferns under family Bibles to ensure even flattening. There's a joke in here somewhere about spiritual pressure and foliage, but let's move on. A quirky tidbit: there were actually fern album competitions. Judges awarded points not just for rare species, but for arrangement, penmanship, and overall grace of presentation. The 1884 winner of the Norwich Ladies' Fern Society submitted a trifold album that included a poem for each frond. The poem for Dryopteris filixmos rhymed evergreen with unseen. Bold. Historians still argue whether these albums were scientific documents or romantic scrapbookery. The line was thin. For every album with Latin labels and detailed locations. There was another filled with watercolors, pressed violets, and the occasional lock of hair tucked between fronds. You pause on a spread showing ferns from a single village, lane each labelled by location, near postbox, under style, by Mr. Calthorpe's angry goose. It's oddly moving. A map of someone's small, beloved world rendered in green. There's something else tucked into the spine of folded letter. You carefully slide it out. The handwriting is looped and precise. Dearest H, I send this frond not for rarity, but for memory. Do you recall the day we walked to Whitby, the air thick with salt and rain? This fern came from the cliff path. It reminds me of your coat, your grin, the way your bonnet tried to flee in the wind. I keep it close, yours always N. You placed the letter back where it was. Who M was, we'll never know. A cousin, a friend, something more. The fern doesn't say, but it remembers. In this small room, in this little album, there's a hole. Life pressed between pages, rainy walks, scraped knees, quiet victories. The thrill of finding a new species or just the joy of seeing a familiar one. Still there, still growing. One page contains only one word beneath the fern, survived. No context, no location, just that. You find yourself nodding. That's enough. Sometimes these albums were also tools of connection. Some families created fern letters where pressed fronds and notes were sent back and forth, each adding their own finds, a kind of Victorian plant-based pen pal system. One woman reportedly had 5 ongoing fern correspondences across 3 counties and said she preferred it to courting. Fair. And here's a detail few people mention. Pressing ferns was slow. You couldn't rush it. You had to wait days, sometimes weeks. It taught patience, attentiveness, care. In an era spinning ever faster with steam and soot, the fern album was a small, stubborn act of quiet. You close Miss Gadsworth's album gently. The cat stirs unimpressed. Outside, a cart rolls past, its wheels clattering on cobblestones. Inside, the room holds its breath, and as you stand to leave, you realize you've just read a diary but one written in fronds and footnotes in moss and margins. A green autobiography of someone you'll never meet, and yet now somehow know. The Victorians didn't just love ferns. They trusted them to hold their memories, to mark their days, to remind them of where they'd been and who they were becoming. Pressed, but not forgotten. Today, you're on a train, a proper, puffing, slightly sooty Victorian train, rattling its way across the English countryside. The window beside you is smudged, the seat scratchy, and the tea served lukewarm in a cup that may or may not have been washed since the Crimean War. But you're not here for the luxury. You're on your way to one of the great social phenomena of the 19th century. The fern hunting excursion. Yes, organized trips by rail, coach, or foot into the wild for the sole purpose of collecting ferns. What began as a hobby for solitary wanderers quickly evolved into a social event. Entire groups packed up baskets, field guides, and questionable sandwiches to brave the countryside in search of elusive fronds. Mainstream historical fact. By the 1860s and 70s, fern hunting excursions were regularly advertised in newspapers and organized by local natural history clubs, schools, and, of course, fern societies. They often combined botany, fresh air, and if the organizers were optimistic, character building. The whistle blows as the train pulls into a modest station, and you join the flurry of passengers disembarking, many clutching walking sticks, and canvas bags already peering eagerly at nearby hedgerows. Your group an enthusiastic mix of schoolboys, stern aunties, and one suspiciously overdressed man named Reginald assembles near a field path. Someone hands you a folded pamphlet titled Common Ferns of Devonshire and their associated mirths. The associated mirths remain unspecified. The countryside is damp as usual, the path muddy, but spirits are high. You all set off together, a ragtag parade of naturalists, each with one goal, to find something rare, or at least to say you did as you trudge up a gentle slope. The air smells of wet grass and sheep-related decisions. You hear snippets of conversation. It's got the sorry, but not the stalk hair. My uncle says Dryopteris is the work of the devil. Don't step there. It's boggy. Squelch. A young girl proudly brandishes a freshly plucked Blechnum spikenard, while her brother sulks over a mere moss clump, not even a liverwort, he mutters. And here's your quirky tidbit: some fern hunting excursions offered prizes, most unusual find, most complete root system, and in one truly niche case, best identified penny under duress. The winner was a man who correctly classified a fern while being stung by bees. You pause beside a shady wall where a few brave fronds peek out. A woman in a bonnet, clearly the expert of the group, leans in and murmurs, Asplenium rutimeraria. Good eye, but too common. Move along. The fern, for its part, does not care. The pace slows as the group spreads out. You hear laughter ahead. Someone's slipped on a rock and landed beside a perfectly intact Polypodium vulgare. See? She grins, holding it up. Worth it. Historians still argue whether these excursions were more about socializing than science. It's true they provided the rare opportunity for unchaperoned young people to chat beneath the guise of plant appreciation. One minister wrote disapprovingly that fern hunts were an occasion for flirtation and muddy hens. The next week, 2 of his parishioners eloped with a fern, probably docked by midday. You've reached the designated picnic site, a clearing beside a stream, where blankets are laid out and baskets opened with theatrical flair. The sandwiches are soggy, the lemonade warm, and someone forgot the cutlery. But no one minds. The stream gurgles contentedly nearby, and ferns of every kind frame the scene like an oil painting. People compare finds. One woman produced a velvet-lined case containing a folded pressing kit, and announces that she's located a hybrid probably. Her companion responds by waving a truly bedraggled fern and declaring, Mine fought back. You lie back on the grass and look up through the trees. Dappled sunlight filters through soft, flickering, fern-like. You realize the appeal of these outings wasn't just the plants. It was this, the moment of peace, of shared purpose, of green stillness in a noisy world. The return trip is quieter, pleasantly tired. The group meanders back toward the train station. Mud-streaked and content. There are fewer arguments now, more quiet exchanges. Did you see that patch near the stile? I think I dropped my guidebook by the gorse. We should do this again. One elderly gentleman, the kind who wears his socks very high and his spectacles very low, clutches his bag with obvious pride. Inside is a small, unremarkable fern. Nothing rare. He says, but it was mine to find. You board the train with your own frond carefully tucked into a folded envelope. It's slightly crushed. It's definitely common, but you feel a little closer to it now, like maybe you earned it. As the train chugs back toward the city, the countryside rolls past. Your window in fading light. You think about the strange joy of walking with strangers, the delight of green things in unexpected places, and the satisfying ache of your legs after a good, pointless adventure. And you realize something. Pterodomania wasn't just about ferns. It was about seeking, about looking closer, about being the kind of person who kneels beside a mossy wall and thinks, maybe, just maybe, there's something beautiful here. You close your eyes, head against the train window, and let the rhythm of the tracks lull you back into stillness. Somewhere behind you, a fern grows quietly in a paper packet, and that's enough. It's late evening now, and you're standing in the musty back room of a little Victorian bookshop, the kind that smells of wood smoke, dust, and barely suppressed judgment. A single gas lamp flickers overhead, casting just enough light to reveal your latest treasure, a shelf devoted entirely to fern literature. That's right. Tonight we delve into the leaf-strewn pages of books, guides, and fern-fueled passion, projects that once filled the drawing rooms and satchels of pterodomaniacs across the empire. You run your hand along the cracked spines, rustic ferns of Westmoreland, ferns for the windowsill, spiritual growth through Sorry. Okay, that last one might have been satire, but then again, this was Victorian Britain. Mainstream historical fact. Fern literature exploded in popularity during the fern craze, with over 300 titles published between 1840 and 1890. These ranged from serious botanical texts to illustrated gift books, devotional hybrids, children's fables, and even fern-themed poetry. You slide one book from the shelf, The Ferns of Great Britain and Ireland by Thomas Moore. Heavy, leather-bound, smells like long winters and moral obligation. Inside, the illustrations are hand-colored lithograph soft washes of green, detailed to the point of obsession. Each fern sits upright, posed like a Victorian debutante, its fronds arranged with delicate composure. The text is, shall we say, thorough. You learn more than you ever wanted to know about the base of the Reikis. You are now uncomfortably aware of the word indusium, and yet it's weirdly comforting. You imagine Mr. Moore hunched over his desk by candlelight, eyes blurry, painstakingly describing every pinner and sub-pinner as if the fate of the empire depended on it. Nearby, a stack of smaller books, popular ferns, the kind designed for ladies' parlours and rainy afternoons. Ferny Comrades is one, the Parlour Fern book is another. You flip through a copy of Our Woodland Friends and find an entire chapter in which a lonely fern befriends a talkative snail and helps him navigate class anxiety. Charming, deeply questionable, but charming. A quirky tidbit. One bestseller of the time, the Fern Garden included fashion advice, tips for arranging ferns in one's hat, and a series of moral fables for the fern lover. In one, a boastful polypody loses its colour from vanity. In another, a humble spleenwort saves an orphan squirrel. Ferns were not just plants, they were role models. Historians still argue whether fern books were more educational or performative. Some scholars believe they masked domestic boredom with the illusion of scientific purpose. Others argue they provided a rare intellectual outlet for women at a time when formal study was largely off-limits. Either way, the result is the same. Shelves upon shelves of gently decaying books, their pages pressed with ferns. Pencil notes in margins, names inscribed in cursive you can barely read. You stumble on one particularly odd volume, Fern Lore and Legend. Inside, alongside actual species information, are myths and superstitions. Ferns that cure melancholy. Ferns that grant invisibility. Ferns that whisper the names of your true love. If picked at midnight during a thunderstorm while wearing linen gloves and thinking only pure thoughts, specific but tempting, you flip to a chapter titled Of Ferns and Fairies. The idea was common in Victorian folk revival, that ferns, being so ancient and secretive, were somehow magical. The fern seed myth was especially popular, the belief that on Midsummer's Eve, fern spores became briefly visible and could be collected to unlock mystical powers. Spoiler, the spores are always there. They're just really, really small. But why ruin the fun? You lean against the back wall, now surrounded by stacks of green-spined books, and imagine someone, maybe a school teacher, or a bored vicar's daughter curled up beside a fireplace, reading The Fern Lover's Companion while rain taps gently on the WINDOWSILL dot outside. The world demanded so much propriety, appearances, silence. But inside these books, there was wonder, discovery, a sense that even something as small as a curled-up fiddlehead could carry the weight of story. One passage, scribbled in the margin of a second edition copy of Ferns, Their Habits and Homes, reads, saw this. One by the church wall, looked lonely, took it home, thrives beside the piano. And there it is again, that intimacy, that quiet connection between page and place, plant and person. You flip to a final book, Flora Domestica, a household guide from 1823, slightly predating the full pterodomania wave, but already offering rapturous praise for Adianum capillus veneris, the maidenhair fern. The author describes it as a whisper in green, more breath than body. Someone was clearly on their second glass of sherry. When they wrote that, you close the book gently, the lamp flickers again, the cat reappears judging. Always. You offer it a scratch behind the ears, but it vanishes into the stacks. Unimpressed by your newfound botanical knowledge. In this dim little room, time feels soft. The pages don't care about trends. The spores have long since fallen. But the stories remain. So many people, across so many rainy afternoons, sat with these books hoping to understand the ferns around them and maybe themselves. They didn't all get it right. The drawings are occasionally suspect. The Latin is questionable. But the affection, the reverence, that part's unmistakable. You step outside into the misty street. The old shop door creaking shut behind you. Under your arm, one book, Fern's. And you? A bit mouldy. Smells like knowledge. You'll read it by candlelight tonight, just in case. You're at a garden party, but not the kind with cucumber sandwiches and tepid gin, no. This one is different. It's formal, yes, but there's an edge to the atmosphere, a glint in the eyes of the guests that has nothing to do with sunlight. On crystal, because tonight you've wandered into the glorious, ridiculous world of Fern competitions. Yes, Fern competitions. Imagine dog shows, but greener, less barking, marginally less scandal. The grounds are immaculately kept, lawns rolled, flat, white tents fluttering gently in the breeze. A brass band plays, something vaguely triumphant in the distance, and everywhere you turn, there are tables long, cloth-covered tables groaning under the weight of potted ferns. There's a Dryopteris affinis in a mahogany planter, a polystichum, Setiphyrum twirling elegantly in an ornate iron urn. A young man adjusts the position of a Blechnum spikened by precisely for degrees, and then steps back to admire it, arms folded, lips pursed. This is serious business. Mainstream historical fact. By the 1870s, fern shows were regular fixtures in the calendars of horticultural societies across Britain. They were judged events complete with prizes, certificates, and occasionally engraved watering cans for the best in show. The Royal Horticultural Society even introduced fern-specific categories to accommodate demand. And it wasn't just about showing off one's fronds. These events were social battlegrounds, polite, perfumed jewels of cultivation. Winning a prize meant recognition, status, possibly even a small write-up in the Gardener's Weekly Gazette. Losing meant 3 weeks of sulking and writing passive-aggressive notes about someone else's inferior story. You drift toward the judging tent, where a small crowd has gathered. Inside, 3 elderly men and 1 very composed lady are peering at a cyathier deal barter as though it might confess to tax fraud. Judging criteria are strict: uniformity of fronds, absence of pests, appropriate moisture, graceful presentation, and above all, purity of species. None of this hybrid nonsense, as one judge mutters, filthy crossbreeding. Historians still argue whether these competitions helped advance botanical knowledge or just encouraged snobbery. Likely both. One recorded argument from 1883 escalated when a judge accused a contestant of unnaturally fertilizing their aetherium. That's Victorian for cheating, or something much worse, depending on the accent. A quirky tidbit: at the 1887 London Fern exhibition, one man attempted to pass off a plastic well. Wax fern as a real specimen. He was disqualified immediately, but later sold the model to a department store for window displays. Too beautiful to be real, the clerk reportedly said. Indeed. Back at the party, a bell rings. Judging is over. The results are in. A hush falls. First place in the native species. Indoor-grown category goes to Miss Cecily Farrow for her Asplenium scolopendrium, lovingly cultivated from spore and tended with Mozart and moral poetry. The crowd applauds. Her frond glistens. Her rivals grit their teeth so hard you can hear it beneath the brass band's triumphant reprise. Second place is awarded posthumously, not to a deceased person but to a fern. The note reads, would have taken gold if not tragically overwatered. A cautionary tale into words, soggy roots. You wander among the losing tables. Some entries are perfectly fine, lush, proud, green, but in a field this competitive, fine is failure. One plant leans to the left like it's given up entirely. The label simply reads, Eleanor's regret. A young boy nearby is arguing with a judge, but it's the only one with a name. He insists it's Jeremy. The judge sighs. We do not award points for personification. Some guests are clearly here for the show rather than the science. A man in a lemon-colored waistcoat is sketching ferns while dramatically sipping punch. A woman in an oversized bonnet claims to have never touched soil in her life, but came for the aesthetic. She's currently trying to flirt with a judge by quoting the Fairy Queen and batting her eyelashes over a potted adianum. The fern seems unimpressed. And here's the wild part: people would travel by train for hours, with carts full of potted ferns. Some used bespoke fern transportation crates, lined with moss and moist cloths. Others simply sat with them on their laps like leafy infants. One attendee in 1879 was fined for taking up to full train seats, one for herself, one for her Lomaria gibber. "It dislikes jostling," she said. "You stop by the refreshments tent. There's lemonade, seed cake, and inexplicably small sandwiches cut into fern shapes." A man with pince nez is holding court about Tris cretica, gesturing wildly enough to scatter crumbs into a nearby specimen. You realize, somewhere between the awards and the sketching, and the minor scandals, that this isn't really about ferns. Not entirely. It's about belonging, having a passion, caring deeply, impractically for something green and unbothered. People need something to root for. And sometimes, quite literally, they root for ferns as the sun dips behind the hedges. Casting long shadows across the competition grounds, you spot one last entry and labeled small, maybe even accidental. It sits slightly off the table, crooked, quiet, a single frond, elegant but modest. You lean in. No plaque, no ribbon, just a folded card with a handwritten note. "I grew this while grieving. It helped. No prize needed." You step away from the tent, the music trailing behind you, and feel that familiar quiet unfurling inside, the peace of growth, the stillness of leaves. Somewhere in your coat pocket, a spore rests. Tomorrow, maybe, you'll plant it. You're back in London now, but not the proper horse-drawn carriage part with tidy squares and respectable lamplight. No. Tonight you find yourself winding through the narrow, crooked back streets of the East End Coal Street brick, rain-slick cobbles. Windows lit in flickers, because while the aristocrats were hosting fern parties and spritzing exotic species, working-class London was cultivating its own fern culture, just with fewer urns and more determination. You duck under a low archway and emerge into a tiny court surrounded by tenement buildings. Wash hangs limp between windows. A dog barks somewhere out of view. And there, tucked in a corner, sits a window box no bigger than a bread tin, overflowing with asplenium and polypodium, their fronds pressed up like curious onlookers to the cracked glass dot. This is the fern of the poor. Not rare, not imported, but cherished all the same. Mainstream historical fact. During the fern craze, even working-class families in Britain's most industrialized cities kept ferns on sills, in cracked pots, wedged between bricks, or growing defiantly from soot-covered alley walls. Adianum and Cystopteris might have been common, but they were a source of pride and calm amid the city's chaos. You peer into a basement flat. There, in the window, a single plant sits atop a battered dresser. Next to it, a small doily, a broken teacup turned upside down, and a hand-colored postcard of Bournemouth. The fern isn't for show, it's for sanity. The Victorians loved to talk about bringing nature indoors, and while the aristocrats did it with imported ferns and Italian marble, the working class did it with sheer stubborn affection, a quirky tidbit in some areas. Fern nights were hosted at local pubs or community centres, informal gatherings, where labourers and shopgirls would bring cuttings to trade, show off unusual frond shapes, or just talk about which walls got the least smoke damage. One surviving flyer from 1875 reads, "Bring your best roots, no snails, pint included." You pass by a chimney sweep's yard where a string of old boots has been nailed to the fence, each one acting as an impromptu pot. From the toe of one, a proud green frond waves hello. It has no Latin label, no pedigree, no certificate, but it is loved. Historians still argue whether this grassroots fern keeping was an imitation of upper-class trends, or an entirely separate movement. Some believe it was aspiration, others argue it was reclamation, a way to find beauty in smoke-stained corners. To soften the hard lines of survival, you step into a tiny alley, where a few bricks have been pulled out from the wall. Someone has carefully lined each hollow with soil and tucked ferns inside. The effect is strange, almost artistic. A living mosaic dot, a woman nearby hair up. Sleeves rolled, leans out of a window and sees you admiring the setup. My boy done. That, she says proudly, keeps the rats out. He says, I think he just likes green things. You nod. Further down the road, you pass a laundry. The air is thick with steam and starch, and yet somehow a row of ferns survives on the sill, slightly wilted but holding their own. A child inside is misting them with a chipped mug. Her sister is singing something softly in the background. You can't make out the tune, but it's sweet. It's easy to romanticize hardship, but there's no denying the tenderness here. These ferns weren't bought at exhibitions or hand-carried from foreign hillsides. They were gathered from railway cuttings, plucked from canal paths, scavenged from wherever there was soil and a sliver of light. One man, a bricklayer in Limehouse, kept a meticulous journal of his fern-keeping efforts. Window box 3 suffered from Mrs. Alcott's cat, replanted with heart's tongue. Doing well. Neighbors still ask to see it. Another entry reads, found one growing behind the brewery. Smells like hops. Good luck fern in an age when plants were status symbols. The working class fern was something more private, acquired resistance, a reminder that you could nurture something fragile. Even when the world wasn't particularly interested in nurturing you. You reach a courtyard where children are skipping rope on a windowsill. One girl has made her own tiny fernery, a cracked fishbowl with a few stones, some dirt, and 3 fronds growing valiantly in the fogged glass. She's drawn a little sign on cardboard, My jungle. No boys. You respect that. There's no applause here. No prizes. But the care is the same. The love is the same. You begin to suspect that ferns grow best where they are noticed, not necessarily where they are paid for. You turn back toward the high street. The fog is rolling in, yellow at the edges, curling through alleys. Gas lamps flicker to life. A piano plays somewhere far off a pub, probably, and over it, the faint sound of someone laughing. You pause at one last window. A single fern, nestled in a rusted tin, sits silhouetted against the lamplight. You can just make out a note tucked beside it. Grow, little one, just keep growing. And in this part of the city among soot and sweat and second-hand hope, that might be the best thing anyone could say. The air is damp again, not from rain this time, but from the fine, ever-present mist that clings to glass and curls at your collar. You've arrived at one of the more peculiar chapters of fern history, the indoor fern craze, or, as one overly enthusiastic housekeeper in 1870 called it, greenery for the morally inclined. You step into a drawing room, not a grand estate hall, but a respectable middle-class parlor, the kind with anti-macassars on every chair and a piano that nobody's played since the Crimean War, and in the corner, glowing softly in the gaslight, is a Wardian case. Its magnificent arched glass panels, polished brass framework, delicate feet. Inside, a miniature rainforest. Tiny adianum ferns unfurl like dancers. Moss clings to stones. A single curled fiddlehead waits patiently to stretch. The effect is hypnotic, like gazing into a dream just on the edge of waking. Mainstream historical fact, the Wardian case, invented by Dr. Nathaniel Bagshaw Ward in the 1830s, revolutionized plant transportation and domestic botany. Originally used to ship plants across oceans without them dying en route, Victorians soon realized it also made a perfect showcase for delicate ferns, especially in polluted cities, where open-air gardening was nearly impossible. By the 1850s, every respectable parlor had a Wardian case. It became the fish tank of its day, but with fewer bubbles and significantly more misting. You lean in, peering past the glass. Someone has arranged small pebbles and even a tiny bench inside a fern vignette. Cute, overwhelmingly tree, but clearly done with care. You find a diary entry tucked beside the case. Mother says I should grow moss instead, less sinful. But I do so love the little green ones. They're like whispers behind glass, and indeed, the Wardian case was more than decor. For many, it became a personal refuge, a way to create a small, ordered patch of nature within the chaos of coal, smoke, factory noise, and dinner parties about nothing. A quirky tidbit: some Victorians gave their fern cases names. Mr. Biddle's Folly, Lady Flora, and the Green Retiring Room are all documented examples. One man claimed to speak to his daily. Another claimed his case responded by fogging up when sad. Historians still argue whether the rise of domestic fern display was truly about plant love or just another excuse for upper and middle-class families to show they had taste, patience, and enough income to ignore more pressing concerns like the cost of coal or the neighbors. Coughing fits? You look around the room. There's a small side table stacked with books, some of the ones you saw in that old bookshop. A tea service sits untouched. A cat is curled on a patch of sunlight that's barely managing to break through the window pane. And here's something interesting. Not all fern displays were indoors. Some houses built window ferns with shallow wooden troughs nestled into sills, filled with moss, stone, and whatever species could tolerate neglect and smoke. You stroll down a lane later that day and spot dozens of them. Tiny urban jungles peering out at soot streaked streets. Some are lush, some gasping. One appears to be mostly moss with a single triumphant truss, still counts dot inside homes, though. The Wardian case reigned supreme. Its appeal wasn't just botanical, it was philosophical. Victorians loved the idea of controlled nature. A world within glass, a place where you could be both gardener and god. Some even placed mirrors behind their cases to give the illusion of infinite green, an entire ecosystem repeating forever. Because if one fern is soothing, imagine what eternity might do. One particularly intense letter from 1876 reads, "I gaze upon my fern case when agitated. It has a calming influence. Last Tuesday, my husband spoke out of turn. I stared into the moss for 1 hour and was restored to grace." You wonder how the husband fared. It wasn't all serenity. Wardian cases were temperamental. Too much water and you got mildew. Too little and the fronds crisped like autumn leaves. One woman reportedly fainted after discovering her entire case had perished during a 2-day trip to Margate because overzealous nephew with watering can. In wealthier homes, servants were sometimes tasked with maintaining the cases. This often led to conflict. One disgruntled housemaid anonymously wrote to a gardening magazine in 1881. "They ask us to dust the tops but not disturb the atmosphere. What is one to do when the fern gets aphids whisper at them?" And yet, despite the fuss, these cases endured. Long after the craze had faded, people kept their mini jungles alive, often turning them into terrariums for other plants or simply letting them stand empty. Like ornate glass coffins for ferns long gone, you sit down beside one now. Its glass is cloudy. Inside, a few brave fronds still rise from the soil, holding on, growing slowly, quietly. And maybe that's the point. In a world that spun on soot and sound, these little cases offered silence, stillness, control, yes, but also something closer to surrender. You couldn't make the fern grow faster. You couldn't force it to flourish. You just had to watch and wait. And hope. It's evening again, and you're standing at the threshold of a different kind of sanctum, a space once reserved for hushed reverence, amateur speculation, and occasionally an accidental frog. You found your way into a Victorian fernery, and not just any fernery, but one of the grand ones. Welcome to the glass cathedral of chlorophyll. It's enormous. Iron-framed glass walls stretch upward, disappearing into a haze of condensation. Every surface is wet to the touch, and the air is dense with the smell of damp earth and soft decay. Somewhere in the distance, you hear the sound of trickling water, a small man-made waterfall echoing gently. The whole place sighs with green. Mainstream historical fact. By the mid-19th century, wealthy Victorians began constructing elaborate ferneries, indoor or outdoor glasshouses entirely dedicated to the cultivation and display of ferns. Some were modest additions to homes. Others were full-blown architectural marvels, complete with heated floors, artificial fog, and exotic imports that had no business surviving in English weather. And let's be clear, these weren't just fancy gardens. These were status statements. To own a fernery meant you were not only cultured and botanically inclined, it meant you could afford a dedicated space for non-edible greenery. That's a power move. You walk through a curved path flanked by raised stone beds. On your left, a towering tree fern fans out like a Victorian lady's parasol. On your right, smaller fronds tremble slightly as a breeze slips through the vents overhead. The temperature is tropical. Your spectacles fog. A butler in crisp waistcoat appears silently beside you with a towel. For the glasses, sir. He vanishes just as quietly. You wonder if he lives here. Perhaps the ferns do the hiring. A quirky tidbit in one particularly lavish estate. The owner commissioned a full-time fern attendant whose duties included leaf polishing, morning misting, and reading poetry aloud to sensitive specimens. The man later published a memoir titled Fronds Before Friends. Unclear whether it was satire. Also unclear whether he had friends. Historians still argue whether these grand ferneries were driven by genuine botanical passion, or the Victorian urge to catalogue and control every inch of the natural world. Some call them the greenhouses of empire miniature colonial experiments, filled with plants plucked from tropical locales, and forced to adapt to polite British humidity schedules. You reach the centre of the fernery where a marble bench sits beside a shallow pool. Koi glide through it lazily, occasionally inspecting the roots of a hanging Asplenium nidus above. A plaque on the wall reads, built in 1864 for Lady N. Ditherley, who believed ferns promoted moral purity. You're not sure about moral purity, but your skin feels oddly dewy. That must count for something. These ferneries weren't just for quiet admiration either. They were social spaces. Invitations were sent, tea was served. Guests were expected to walk slowly, comment appreciatively, and refrain from picking anything even. If it looks like a weed, Margaret. One guest book from a private fernery includes entries such as, the tree fern was divine. The sandwiches, less so. Atmospheric. I believe I saw God in a spleenwort. Regrettably fainted from the heat. Apologize for damaging moss. Even Queen Victoria herself reportedly enjoyed visiting ferneries, though she was famously disapproving of hybrids. Too unpredictable, a fern, she once suggested, should know its place. There's something curiously spiritual about the space, the high ceilings, the filtered light, the hush. You catch yourself tiptoeing as if not to disturb the spores. Someone is tending to a shaded corner with a small brass spritzer and what looks like the botanical equivalent of a surgeon's tray. You nod. They nod. Fern people recognize their own. And yet, despite all the grandeur, you notice something small, a single wild frond poking defiantly from a crack in the stone floor. It wasn't planted. It just grew. A volunteer. A gate crasher. The most Victorian thing in this room, really. You kneel beside it. It's unremarkable, no exotic shape. No dramatic story, but somehow more moving than the sculpted displays nearby. This is what all this was for, wasn't it? Not the glass, the wrought iron, the French tiles. Just this, the quiet marvel of something, choosing to grow. You rise and continue on, passing a display labeled Specimens of Empire. Ferns from India, Jamaica, South Africa, each labeled, catalogued, neatly trimmed. You read the tags with interest, but also a growing awareness of how much was taken renamed. Repotted dot, it's hard to look at the beauty without seeing the weight of it. Some fronds come with stories. You can't flatten into a Wardian case still. There's no denying the wonder here. You reach the far end of the fernery and look back across the path. Every shape of green, every texture of leaf, the way the air shimmers slightly, heavy with moisture, the way everything feels alive but not rushed. Just slowly, confidently, unfolding dot, it's hard not to feel smaller in here, and softer, like the ferns have reminded you of something you once knew as a child: how to watch, how to wait, how to stay still long enough for something lovely to happen. And just before you leave, you find a tiny brass sign beside the exit. It reads, "Please return with less haste and more wonder." You nod. You will. You step out of the herbarium and into a drizzle that feels like it was specifically invented. For Victorian nostalgia, just enough to dampen your hat, but not enough to justify an umbrella. The air is cooler now, tinged with smoke and the soft sigh of chimney pots, and as you walk, a question creeps in, quiet but persistent. Where did it all go? This Fern fever, this collective madness for fronds, this empire-wide infatuation with spores and sorry, because tonight we arrive at the end, or perhaps the ebb, of pterodomania, mainstream historical fact. By the 1890s, the great fern craze that had gripped Britain for over half a century was beginning to wane. Public exhibitions drew smaller crowds. Fern nurseries shuttered. The popular books stopped being reprinted. Even the mighty Wardian case gathered dust beside the unused piano. And like so many Victorian obsessions, it didn't go out with a bang, but with a long, slow, leafy exhale. You walk past a once grand townhouse, its iron fence is rusting, and the small fernery visible through a cracked side window is choked with ivy. The glass roof sags. A bird has made a nest in what was once a prize-winning asplenium. Life goes on, indifferent to awards. So what happened? Part of it was simple. Taste changed. The same middle-class households that had once scrambled to build miniature jungles in their parlors moved on to other trends: sunflowers, Japanese aesthetics, electric lighting. People traded in ferns for phonographs. The world was speeding up. The 20th century was coming. Steam was no longer romantic, it was loud, practical, industrial. The quiet allure of the fern couldn't compete with the buzz of a motor car or the flash of cinema reels. You pass a rubbish pile behind a shop. Among the scraps, a broken Wardian case, its glass shattered, its base still faintly green with algae. It looks strangely delicate, like a ghost of a time when even plants were curated into stories. A quirky tidbit: in 1903, a satire magazine ran a piece titled Confessions of a Fern Addict, in which the narrator weeps uncontrollably upon misidentifying a male fern. It was meant as parody, but for some, it hit a little too close to home. Historians still argue whether the decline of fern mania was a natural shift in public interest, or a quiet cultural retreat from the excesses of empire and domestic clutter. Some say it was simply a victim of its own success. Once every home had ferns, the thrill was gone. Others believe new scientific discoveries, especially in genetics and ecology, moved attention away from ornamental collecting toward more structured academic study. But perhaps it's deeper than that. Perhaps ferns were never meant to be fashionable. They're too old, too slow, too stubbornly green to care about trends. Pterodomania tried to make them the centerpiece, but ferns, like all truly ancient things, resisted drama. They just wanted to grow. And so, over time, the ferneries were boarded up. The ferns on windowsills were replaced by lace curtains. The illustrated books fell out of print. A generation passed without knowing what a sorry even was. You reach a park. It's nearly dark now, and the lamp posts buzz faintly in the fog. A small path winds away from the main road, damp leaves squishing underfoot, and there, at the edge of a mossy stone bridge, you see it. A fern. No plaque, no case, no exhibition tent. Just a fern growing from a crack in the stone. Alone, persistent, you kneel down. The fronds are soft, vibrant. They don't care about Victorian society. They don't care about lost medals or defunct horticultural clubs. They've been doing this since before humans could spell fern. And somehow, here they still are. You imagine the people who once obsessed over them: Lady Ditherley and her moral purification schemes, the East End girl with her moss-filled fishbowl, the boy who named his fern Jeremy. You think of the lovers who pressed fronds into letters, the children who traced them on windowsills, the amateur scientists who wrote long, breathless descriptions of the curve of Arachis. They're gone now, but the ferns still here, growing, in gutters, out of walls, beneath benches, and between gravestones. You brush your hand across the leaves. They bend, then bounce back, unfazed, unbothered, quietly victorious. And perhaps that's the best ending pterodomania could have asked for. Not a grand finale, Not a museum display, but this, a single, stubborn fern, alive, uninvited, and exactly where it wants to be. The sky has darkened now to that perfect velvet shade blue fading into black, dotted faintly with gaslight halos and the first hesitant stars. You've drifted far from the glass domes and drawing rooms, from the curated gardens and East End windowsills, and yet, even here, with no exhibit labels or gentlemen botanists in sight, the ferns are still with you, because tonight we end where all good things eventually return, the wild. You walk slowly along a wooded path, damp leaves crunching. Beneath your feet, the air rich with peat and the soft sigh of trees. Moonlight catches on dewdrops, each one a tiny mirror. There's no gas lamp here, no orchestra, no tea service, just the quiet hush of living things being left alone. Mainstream historical fact, long before the Victorians collected, displayed, dissected and obsessed over them, ferns were thriving quietly in Britain's woodlands, moors, and shaded crevices, and they never stopped. Even as pterodomania faded from parlours and papers, wild ferns remained steadfast and, frankly, unimpressed. You crouched beside a mossy log, nestled beneath it, a delicate heart-stung fern, its leaves a whole unrippled like green tongues. Glistening in the moonlight, you touch one gently. It's cool, slick, impossibly ancient. Ferns are survivors. That's not poetic license, it's evolutionary truth. These plants have been around for more than 300 million years. They watched the dinosaurs rise and fall, endured ice ages, droughts, and the Industrial Revolution. The Victorians didn't discover ferns. They just noticed them for a little while. A quirky tidbit, some fossilized ferns found in coal deposits are so perfectly preserved that their cell structures remain visible under microscopes. One researcher in the 1920s reportedly burst into tears. After identifying a fossil identical to a living species, "She's still here," he said. Historians still argue whether our fleeting obsessions like fern mania are meaningful or merely curiosities of cultural fashion. But the ferns don't argue. They just grow. You follow a trickling stream, the ground growing softer beneath your boots. The forest seems to lean in. Every stone wears a green coat. Every hollow breathes spores. You catch the faint smell of wet bark and crushed bracken. Time seems slower here, or maybe irrelevant. You pass a crumbling wall once part of a long-forgotten estate. Now, it's almost entirely swallowed by ivy and ferns. Polypodium, most likely. Resilient, opportunistic, beautiful. You half expect to hear the whisper of a Victorian gardener complaining about the draught. There's something poetic in it, isn't there? That all the effort, the Wardian cases, the exhibitions, the train rides and tweet-lined journals led back to this silent, unsupervised glade. The original fernery, created not by hands but by time and water and a little shade. You pause at a clearing. A full moon hangs above you now, bathing the forest floor in silver. All around, ferns curl and uncurl, their movements too slow for the eye, but not for the heart. You imagine spores drifting on the breeze, landing where they will. You imagine some Victorian boy, his trousers muddy, his notebook soggy, kneeling, right where you are, scribbling Latin with the breath of wonder in his lungs. And you smile, because maybe that's the real story. Not the medals or the societies, not the scandals or the poetry or even the fern-shaped sandwiches, but this. One person alone in the quiet, looking at a green thing and thinking, this matters. And they weren't wrong. You sit for a while, letting your thoughts slow. Your breathing matches the hush of the leaves. Somewhere nearby, a night bird sings. The ground is damp beneath you, but not uncomfortable. Just real. No cases. No judgment, no prizes, just presence. Eventually, you rise, brushing dirt from your coat. You glance back at the ferns one last time. They don't need you. They never did. But it's nice to have noticed them. Asterisk, and now, as the last spores settle and the forest dims, let yourself soften to. Breathe in deeply. Let the damp woodland air, imagined or not, fill your lungs with cool quiet. Picture the ferns once more, those ancient, steady companions growing slowly in silence without audience. without praise. Let their patience become your peace. The Victorians may have pressed them between pages, encased them in glass, fought over their fronds and mapped them across empires, but none of that changed the fern. It always grew gently. So tonight, maybe you can let go a little. Let go of the need to rush to cure it, to be brilliant or productive or dazzling. You don't need to flower. You just need to unfurl. Feel your limbs growing heavy, your breath slower. Let thoughts fade like footprints in moss. There is no deadline here, no noise, just the soft rhythm of leaves. And maybe, somewhere deep in your own internal forest, something small and green is waiting, quietly alive, ready to grow. You don't need to chase it. Just rest. Let the ferns keep watch tonight. Sweet dreams.